There was a moment in 1983 when a Soviet early warning satellite detected 5 incoming American intercontinental ballistic missiles. The officer on duty, a man named Stanislav Petrov, had approximately 3 minutes to decide whether to report the alert up the chain of command, which would have triggered a Soviet nuclear response, or to hold. The system had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had detected a launch signature, processed the data, generated an alarm, and escalated to a human being. Everything functioned correctly, and yet the missiles did not exist. A quirk of sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds had fooled a satellite into reading the sky as a launch event. Petrov held. He called it a false alarm, went against protocol, and the world continued. Not because a system worked, because one man decided, in that moment, not to trust the system he was responsible for operating. That incident, classified for years, tells you more about the Cold War than almost any other single event. Because the Cold War was not primarily a story of diplomacy or ideology or even military confrontation. It was a story of systems, of structures built to function in a world where human beings might no longer be present to make decisions, of buildings constructed to survive the obliteration of the cities around them, of communication networks designed to operate after every switchboard operator was dead, of launch protocols engineered to remove hesitation from the equation entirely, because hesitation, in the calculus of nuclear war, was the thing most likely to get you destroyed first. The 19 structures this narration examines are not monuments. They were not built to be admired or remembered. They were built to be used, and then, ideally, never to be spoken of again. Some were never officially acknowledged. Some remain operational today under different names or under the same classification levels that protected them for decades. Some have been declassified only partially, their blueprints and capacities still sealed in archives that require security clearances no civilian researcher will ever receive. What unites them is the logic that built them, and that logic was not strategic in the way military planners publicly describe strategy. It was deeper than that. It was based on the assumption that civilization, as a functioning social organism, would at some point cease to exist, and that certain functions of governance and war-making needed to survive that cessation, continue operating, and eventually prevail. The Cold War is often described as a long peace. That description was always more comfortable than accurate. Between 1947 and 1991, the world came within measurable distance of nuclear exchange on at least a dozen documented occasions and on an unknown number of undocumented ones. The systems built during those decades were not built in anticipation of a long peace. They were built in anticipation of a very short, very complete catastrophe. And the men and women who built them took that anticipation seriously enough to spend billions of dollars across multiple decades creating infrastructure that most of the population they were meant to protect knew nothing about. To understand these structures, you need to understand how the Cold War actually felt to the people managing it from inside, which is very different from how it appeared from outside. From outside, from the perspective of an average American or Soviet citizen, the Cold War was a background condition, a low hum of anxiety, occasionally spiking during moments like the Cuban Missile Crisis, but mostly present as a kind of atmospheric pressure rather than an acute threat. From inside the national security apparatus of either superpower, the Cold War felt nothing like that. It felt like managing a system that was constantly on the edge of catastrophic failure, where the margin between stability and apocalypse was not measured in political decisions, but in equipment malfunctions, communication delays, misread data, and the emotional states of people sitting at consoles at 3 a.m. The structures built during this period were meant to address the gap between those two experiences. The gap between how manageable the situation appeared from outside and how genuinely fragile it was from inside. They were built to create, artificially, a kind of stability that did not actually exist in the underlying strategic environment. And in doing that, they created something else entirely, something that their builders may not have fully intended, which was a world in which the continuation of nuclear war became, in certain scenarios, more automated than the decision to start it. The first structure worth examining in this context is not a single building, but a concept made physical across thousands of miles. The distant early warning line, known as the DEW line, was a chain of radar stations built across the Arctic in the early to mid-1950s, stretching from Alaska through Canada and across to Greenland and Iceland. The strategic logic was straightforward. Soviet bombers carrying nuclear weapons would approach the continental United States from the north, over the pole, because that was the shortest route. Radar stations positioned far enough north would detect those bombers early enough to give American air defenses time to respond. The DEW line was the outermost layer of a detection architecture designed to ensure that the first warning of nuclear attack arrived early enough to matter. What made the DEW line significant was not the technology, which was standard radar of the period, nor the geographic scale, which was impressive but not unprecedented. What made it significant was the administrative reality it created. Over 50 stations, manned by rotating crews of military and civilian contractors, positioned in some of the most remote and inhospitable terrain on the planet, connected by communication lines that had to function in temperatures cold enough to crack metal, operated continuously for decades. The DEW line was always operating. It did not pause for holidays or equipment inspections or personnel changes. The radar swept the sky every few seconds, regardless of what was happening anywhere else in the world, and the data it generated flowed into processing systems that would, under the right conditions, initiate alerts that could not be easily recalled. There were false alarms. The DEW line generated false alarms from its early years of operation into the 1980s, and each false alarm was a test of the system surrounding it. In 1960, radar at Thule Air Base in Greenland, which was connected to the DEW line network, detected what appeared to be a massive Soviet missile launch. The alert propagated upward through the command structure, reaching the top levels of the American military within minutes. The confirmation process revealed the problem. The radar had detected the moon rising over Norway. The curvature of the Earth, combined with the specific angle of the radar beam and atmospheric conditions, had made the moon look, to the system, like hundreds of incoming ballistic missiles. The physical structure of the DEW line was functioning perfectly. The interpretation of the data it generated was catastrophically wrong. These false alarms were not treated as embarrassments to be publicly acknowledged. They were treated as technical problems to be corrected through system improvement. The response to each false alarm was not to question whether the system should exist or whether its sensitivity was appropriate, but to improve the accuracy of the detection algorithms, to add confirmation steps, to layer additional sensors. The underlying premise that detection and response needed to be fast and automatic was never questioned. It was treated as a given, a physical constraint of the strategic environment, and the structures built around that premise grew more elaborate with each passing year. The second structure in this account is the Cheyenne Mountain Complex in Colorado, which became operational in 1966 and which represents more than almost any other single construction of the Cold War period. The architectural embodiment of the fear that drove the entire enterprise. Cheyenne Mountain was built inside a mountain. Not on the side of a mountain, not at the base of a mountain, but inside one. The granite of the Cheyenne Mountain Massif was excavated to create a series of chambers, and inside those chambers, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, known as NORAD, established its operations center. The chambers were lined with steel and mounted on enormous springs designed to absorb the shock of a nearby nuclear detonation. The complex was connected to the outside world by tunnels that could be sealed with blast doors weighing hundreds of tons. The air supply was filtered and could be isolated from external contamination. The water supply was internal. The power supply was redundant. The entire structure was designed to survive a nuclear attack on the immediate area and to continue functioning afterward. What Cheyenne Mountain was designed to do was straightforward. It was meant to be the place from which American military leadership could observe an incoming nuclear attack, assess its scope and origin, and coordinate the response. It was the nerve center of a detection and command architecture that stretched across the globe. And it was built inside a mountain because the people who built it believed, with complete sincerity, that they needed a facility that would survive the destruction of every major American city and continue to function while those cities were burning. The springs on which the equipment rooms were mounted were 15 feet tall and coil-wound from high-tensile steel. There were over 1,000 of them supporting the buildings inside the complex. The buildings themselves were freestanding steel structures inside the rock chambers, and they were connected to each other by flexible corridors that could move independently during a blast without breaking the seals between compartments. The entire design reflected an engineering philosophy that accepted, as a baseline assumption, that the world outside the mountain would at some point cease to exist in any recognizable form, and that the work inside the mountain needed to continue regardless. That philosophy had a name. It was called continuity of operations, and it was applied not just to military command structures, but to the entire architecture of Cold War governance. The question that drove continuity of operations planning was simple and unanswerable, and yet endlessly analyzed. If a nuclear exchange began, and the normal structures of government and military command were destroyed in the first minutes or hours, what would remain? And would what remained be sufficient to continue making decisions and directing forces? The answer that emerged from years of study was that nothing in the existing structure of government was adequate for that purpose. The President, the Cabinet, the Congress, the military Joint Chiefs, all of these people and institutions were concentrated in a small geographic area on the east coast of the United States, an area that would be among the first targets of any Soviet strike. If those targets were destroyed simultaneously, which was a realistic possibility given Soviet missile capabilities by the late 1950s, there would be no one left to direct the American response. The missiles would still be in their silos, the submarines would still be at sea, the bombers would still be in the air or on the ground waiting for orders, but the orders would not come because everyone authorized to give them would be dead. This problem was not merely theoretical. It was treated as an operational emergency, and it generated a series of structural responses that fundamentally changed the nature of American governance, and in doing so, created a parallel government that has never been fully visible to the public it was supposedly designed to protect. The third structure in this examination is Raven Rock Mountain Complex in Pennsylvania, also known as Site R, or the Alternate National Military Command Center. Raven Rock was begun in the early 1950s and became operational in 1953. Like Cheyenne Mountain, it was built inside a mountain, but its purpose was somewhat different. Where Cheyenne Mountain was primarily an intelligence and detection facility, Raven Rock was designed to be a functioning seat of government, a place where senior military officials and their support staffs could relocate in the event of a nuclear attack and continue directing military operations. The complex included office space, communications equipment, sleeping quarters, mess facilities, and the kind of administrative infrastructure required to run a military campaign from an underground facility over an extended period of time. The assumption embedded in its design was that whatever happened on the surface, the American military would continue to function, and that functioning required not just command authority, but the physical infrastructure to support the people exercising that authority. Raven Rock existed in a relationship with a fourth structure that is, in many ways, the most remarkable of all the continuity facilities built during the Cold War. This was the underground installation at Mount Weather in Virginia, operated not by the military, but by the Federal Emergency Management Agency and its predecessors. Mount Weather was the designated relocation site for the civilian leadership of the United States government. Not the president, who had his own dedicated facilities, but the cabinet secretaries, the heads of major federal agencies, and the senior administrative officials who would be needed to maintain the functions of a peacetime government in a post-nuclear environment. Mount Weather had everything Raven Rock had, and more, including hospital facilities, communications equipment capable of reaching any point on the globe, water and power systems designed for extended independent operation, and living quarters for hundreds of people who would descend into the mountain and govern whatever remained of the country from there. The existence of Mount Weather was not publicly acknowledged until 1975, when a commercial aircraft crashed near the facility during bad weather, and the Federal Aviation Administration, in the course of investigating the accident, accidentally confirmed that a classified government installation existed at that location. Congressional hearings followed, and what emerged from those hearings was a partial picture of a system that most legislators, let alone ordinary citizens, had no knowledge of. The system was not just Mount Weather. It was a network of facilities, procedures, and pre-positioned resources designed to ensure that some version of the federal government would survive a nuclear attack and be capable of exercising authority over whatever population survived. That network had its own logic, its own chain of command, and most significantly, its own succession procedures that operated outside the constitutional framework most Americans were familiar with. The Presidential Succession Act defines who becomes president if the president and the people ahead of them in the line of succession are unavailable. But continuity of government planning created a parallel structure in which certain designated officials would assume authority not through constitutional succession, but through emergency executive orders, pre-signed and pre-positioned for use during a crisis. The people who would govern the country in a post-nuclear environment might not be anyone the public had ever heard of or voted for. They would be officials designated in sealed documents, empowered by authorities that had never been publicly debated, operating from facilities that most of the public did not know existed. This is not a conspiracy. It was a policy response to a genuine strategic problem, and it was treated with complete bureaucratic seriousness by the people who designed and maintained it. But it represents something that is easy to overlook in retrospect, which is how completely the Cold War reorganized the internal architecture of American government around the assumption of catastrophe, not around the prevention of catastrophe, around its occurrence. The fifth structure in this account sits in the mountains of West Virginia, beneath a luxury resort. The Greenbrier Hotel in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, was one of the most famous resort destinations in the United States, a place of white columns and manicured lawns and well-heeled guests who had been vacationing there since before the Civil War. Beginning in 1958, a substantial addition was made to the Greenbrier's infrastructure, an addition that the hotel's management was aware of, that the federal government paid for, and that the hotel's guests were entirely unaware of for over 30 years. Beneath the hotel's new West Virginia wing, a facility was constructed that was designed to house the entire United States Congress in the event of a nuclear attack. Over 100,000 square feet of underground space divided into a House chamber, a Senate chamber, committee rooms, communications facilities, dormitories, medical areas, a decontamination facility, and enough food and supplies to sustain several hundred people for 60 days. The Greenbrier facility was maintained continuously from its completion in the early 1960s until 1992, when its existence was revealed by a reporter from the Washington Post. For 30 years, a team of employees posing as audiovisual technicians for the hotel maintained the facility's equipment, rotated its supplies, and kept it in a state of constant readiness. The congressional leadership was briefed on its existence. Most members of Congress were not. The plan, in the event of a nuclear attack with sufficient warning time, was to evacuate the Congress to the Greenbrier, where they would continue their legislative functions from the bunker, while the country above them was destroyed. What the Greenbrier facility reveals, more than any other single structure of the Cold War period, is the gap between the public narrative of nuclear deterrence and the private planning of nuclear survival. The public narrative said that deterrence would prevent nuclear war. The private planning said that deterrence might fail and that Congress needed a bunker under a hotel in West Virginia. Both of these things were true simultaneously, and the people who maintained both of them appear to have seen no contradiction in doing so. Deterrence was the policy. Bunkers were the contingency. The existence of the bunkers did not undermine the policy, at least not in the minds of those who built them. If anything, the seriousness with which the bunkers were constructed and maintained reflected the seriousness with which both the policy and its potential failure were regarded. The sixth structure shifts from American soil to the strategic geography of the North Atlantic. The sound surveillance system, known as SOSUS, was an underwater network of hydrophones, essentially microphones, laid across the floor of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans to detect the acoustic signatures of Soviet submarines. SOSUS was begun in the early 1950s and expanded continuously throughout the Cold War. By its peak, it consisted of thousands of individual hydrophone elements connected by underwater cables to shore-based processing stations, covering enormous swaths of ocean and capable of detecting submarines at ranges of hundreds or even thousands of miles under favorable acoustic conditions. SOSUS was not a building in any conventional sense, but it was a structure, a physical infrastructure of extraordinary scale and sophistication, and it represents a category of Cold War construction that is often overlooked because its components are invisible, lying under thousands of feet of water connected by cables running across the ocean floor. What SOSUS did was transform the oceans from opaque strategic spaces where submarines could hide with relative impunity into partially transparent environments where Soviet submarine movements could be tracked, analyzed, and, in a time of war, targeted. The existence of SOSUS was classified for decades, and even after its existence became publicly known, its specific capabilities and the locations of its shore stations remained classified. Soviet naval planners spent enormous resources trying to understand what the Americans could and could not detect, and the uncertainty itself had strategic value. The Soviets could not know how much SOSUS could see, and that uncertainty constrained their planning. SOSUS also created a strategic asymmetry that had consequences throughout the Cold War. American submarines operated with the knowledge that they were being tracked by Soviet systems, but Soviet submarines operated under the additional burden of not knowing how well they were being tracked by American systems. This asymmetry influenced Soviet submarine deployment patterns, basing decisions, and ultimately the design of new classes of submarines intended to be quieter and therefore harder for SOSUS to detect. The underwater acoustic contest between the two superpowers ran continuously for 4 decades and generated intelligence information that directly influenced targeting decisions, arms negotiations, and strategic assessments on both sides. The seventh structure is the most purely architectural expression of Cold War paranoia in the Soviet context. The Yamantau mountain complex in the southern Ural Mountains of Russia is a facility whose existence has been officially confirmed, but whose purpose has never been formally disclosed. American intelligence agencies began noting unusual construction activity in the area in the 1980s, and by the time of the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, satellite imagery had revealed an underground complex of extraordinary scale being built inside Yamantau Mountain. Construction continued into the 1990s and beyond, during a period when the Russian economy was in severe distress, and vast numbers of Soviet-era military programs were being curtailed or abandoned entirely. Congressional hearings in the 1990s examined the Yamantau facility and received no satisfactory explanation from Russian officials, who variously described it as a mining facility, a government food storage depot, and a general emergency command facility. None of these explanations were regarded as credible by American intelligence analysts, who estimated that the scale of construction was vastly greater than any of those purposes would require. The most serious assessments concluded that Yamantau was the Russian equivalent of the American continuity of government facilities, a place where the leadership of the Russian state and the command infrastructure of its nuclear forces could relocate and survive a nuclear attack, and from which those nuclear forces could continue to be directed. If that assessment is correct, Yamantau represents something sobering about the post-Cold War world. Construction of a massive bunker complex capable of surviving a nuclear war continued in Russia, not during the height of Cold War tension, but during the period of supposed post-Cold War reconciliation, when American and Russian officials were publicly describing a new era of partnership and reduced nuclear risk. Whatever was being built inside Yamantau Mountain, it was being built by people who did not share the public optimism of that period, or who shared it publicly while privately maintaining their preparations for the alternative. The eighth structure is an American answer to the same question Yamantau was answering on the Soviet side. The continuity of government program in the United States, known by various names and classifications at different periods, included not just fixed facilities like Raven Rock and Mount Weather, but a mobile command infrastructure designed to ensure that the President and the Nuclear Command Authority could survive a first strike, even if every fixed facility was destroyed. The most visible component of this mobile infrastructure was the fleet of E-4B aircraft, known as the National Airborne Operations Center, or in the vernacular of the people who worked with them, the Doomsday Planes. The E-4B is a modified Boeing 747, and there are 4 of them, and at least one is always maintained on alert, capable of being airborne within minutes of a warning. The aircraft is equipped with communications systems capable of reaching every element of the American nuclear command structure, including submarines at sea depth, through very low-frequency radio transmissions. It can be refueled in flight, giving it effectively unlimited endurance. Its communications equipment includes the ability to transmit launch orders to land-based missiles and to communicate with the strategic bomber force. The aircraft itself is hardened against the electromagnetic pulse effects of nuclear detonations. It is, in the terminology of strategic planners, a survivable command node, meaning that it can continue to function in the environment that would exist after a nuclear exchange had begun. The existence of the E-4B is not classified. The aircraft can be seen at Andrews Air Force Base, and their role is publicly described in general terms. What remains less public is the specific communication architecture they connect to, the pre-planned message traffic they would transmit, and the emergency action procedures they would follow in a scenario where the normal chain of command had been destroyed. Those details are classified, and they are classified not because their existence is secret, but because the specific content of those procedures represents, in a very direct sense, the operational plan for how American nuclear forces would be directed during and after a nuclear war. Publishing that plan would give an adversary information about which elements of the command structure most needed to be destroyed first. The 9th structure is the least known and perhaps the most consequential of all the facilities examined here. The Soviet Union's perimeter system, known in Russian as perimeter and referred to informally as the dead hand, was a nuclear command and control system designed to ensure that Soviet nuclear forces could launch a retaliatory strike even if the entire Soviet military and political leadership had been killed in an American first strike. Perimeter was not a building in the physical sense, though it required physical infrastructure to operate. It was a system, and its key component was a set of command rockets, physically distinct from nuclear warheads, that were positioned in hardened silos. These command rockets, if launched, would fly over Soviet missile fields, transmitting launch codes, triggering the ballistic missiles to launch without any human intervention. The logic of perimeter was the logic of deterrence carried to its ultimate conclusion. Deterrence rests on the credibility of retaliation. If an adversary believes it can destroy your ability to retaliate before your retaliatory forces can be launched, deterrence breaks down and a first strike becomes strategically rational. Perimeter was designed to remove that possibility entirely. By creating a system that would automatically trigger retaliation even after the complete destruction of the Soviet command structure, it made a first strike strategically irrational, regardless of how complete the destruction was. If you destroy everything, the missiles still launch. The decision had been pre-made, encoded into hardware, and delegated not to a person, but to a machine. The existence of perimeter was not revealed publicly until the early 1990s, when Soviet and Russian officials began discussing it in the context of arms control negotiations. American intelligence agencies had suspected its existence for years based on analysis of Soviet communication patterns and construction activity, but the specifics were not confirmed until Soviet officials confirmed them directly. When the information became public in the West, the reaction was a mixture of fascination and horror. Horror, because the system represented exactly the kind of automated nuclear decision-making that Western strategic thinkers had spent decades arguing was unacceptable. Fascination, because it worked. If perimeter functioned as described, it was technically elegant, strategically coherent, and from a deterrent standpoint, arguably more stabilizing than a system that required human beings to make decisions under the maximum possible stress in the minimum possible time. What no one who has publicly analyzed perimeter has been able to answer with confidence is whether the system remains operational. Russian officials have at various points suggested it does. The command rockets presumably still exist in their silos. The sensors that would detect a nuclear attack on Soviet, and now Russian, territory presumably still function. Whether the entire system remains integrated and capable of executing its original purpose is not publicly known. What is known is that after the Cold War ended, the Russian military did not publicly announce the decommissioning of perimeter. They announced many other reductions and changes. Perimeter was not among them. The 10th structure is the network of underground command posts that both superpowers built throughout the Cold War. Facilities intended to protect military commanders and their staffs, close enough to the surface to exercise real-time command of forces, but hardened enough to survive everything short of a direct nuclear hit. The Soviet version of these facilities was particularly extensive, reflecting a military doctrine that placed heavy emphasis on the survival of command and control infrastructure. The Soviet military built underground command posts at every level of the command hierarchy, from strategic command facilities in Moscow to operational command bunkers for individual front commanders to tactical command posts for division and corps commanders. This layered underground infrastructure meant that the Soviet military had, in theory, the ability to continue exercising command and control even after enormous losses to the above-ground military infrastructure. In Moscow, the scale of underground construction during the Cold War was extraordinary. Intelligence assessments compiled by American agencies over decades suggested that the Soviet government had built an underground city beneath Moscow, a network of tunnels and facilities connecting the Kremlin to military command facilities, to transportation networks that could move leadership and key personnel to safety under the city itself. The Metro 2, as this system came to be called in intelligence documents and eventually in public reporting, was described as a parallel metro system, distinct from the public Moscow metro, designed to transport Soviet leadership and military personnel rapidly to hardened underground facilities in the event of attack. The Metro 2's existence has been neither officially confirmed nor officially denied by Russian authorities. Former Soviet officials who have discussed it have been vague about its specifics. Physical evidence, including air shafts and construction anomalies visible in surface surveys of central Moscow, is consistent with the existence of large underground structures beneath the city. But the specific layout, capacity, and current status of any such system remains unknown. What is known is that the Soviet government spent enormous resources on deep underground construction in and around Moscow throughout the Cold War, and that the purpose of that construction was not civilian infrastructure. The 11th structure is in the American Midwest, and it represents a different kind of Cold War architecture, one defined not by the survival of people, but by the perpetuation of capability. The Minuteman missile silos scattered across Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Nebraska were not built to protect the people who operated them. The launch control facilities were hardened to survive nearby nuclear detonations, but the silo crews, small teams of 2 officers who would spend 24-hour shifts hundreds of feet underground, were not expected to survive a nuclear war. They were expected to perform their duties if called upon to do so, and then to accept whatever came next. The silos themselves were hardened to survive a somewhat less direct hit, because the missiles inside them needed to be capable of launching under attack. But the operational concept made no provision for the long-term survival of the human beings who maintained them. This fact was not hidden from the people who served in the missile silos. They knew what their role was, and the psychological management of that knowledge was a persistent challenge for the Air Force throughout the Cold War. The people who sat in underground launch control facilities 24 hours at a time, with the ability to launch weapons capable of killing millions of people, knowing that if those weapons were ever launched, it was likely because a nuclear war had begun and that their own survival was therefore unlikely, required a particular kind of psychological accommodation to their situation. The Air Force developed extensive protocols for managing this psychological burden, including the two-man rule, which required that any launch procedure require the simultaneous action of two separate officers, partly for security reasons and partly to distribute the psychological weight of the decision across more than one person. The two-man rule did not, of course, eliminate the psychological burden. It displaced it somewhat. And the Air Force discovered throughout the Cold War that the missile crew force had a non-trivial rate of what was termed human reliability concerns, meaning instances in which personnel were determined to be, for whatever reason, potentially unreliable in performing their duties. The rate was low but persistent, and the procedures for identifying and removing personnel who exhibited those concerns were elaborate and ongoing. The system was designed to function with human beings in certain roles, but it was also designed to identify and remove human beings who might function unreliably in those roles, which is another way of saying that the system was designed to minimize the impact of human judgment on its operation wherever human judgment might produce an unwanted outcome. The 12th structure is the least glamorous and perhaps the most practically significant of all the Cold War structures examined here. The Otto von Network, which stood for Automatic Voice Network, was the secure voice communication system of the United States military during the Cold War. It was not a single building or a single facility, but a network of switching centers, cables, and radio links that connected every major military installation in the United States and, through its overseas extensions, military facilities around the world. Autovon was designed to survive nuclear attacks better than the civilian telephone network by distributing its switching functions across multiple hardened nodes so that the destruction of any single node or multiple nodes would not sever the entire network. Autovon also incorporated a precedent system that allocated network capacity during times of crisis, according to the importance of the call being placed. An ordinary call between staff officers might be bumped from the network to make room for a higher precedence call between senior commanders, and a routine command call might be bumped to make room for a flash override call, which was the highest category and reserved for communications of immediate operational significance. The existence of this precedent system reflected a recognition that in a crisis, the network would be saturated with traffic, and that not all of that traffic was equally important. The system needed a mechanism for ensuring that the most important traffic got through even when everything else was failing. Autovon was eventually replaced by more modern digital communication systems, but the logic it embodied, that military communication networks needed to be designed from the start to function in a degraded and partially destroyed environment, remained central to every subsequent military communication architecture. The Defense Information Systems Network, which replaced Autovon, and the various satellite communication systems that supplemented and eventually largely superseded terrestrial networks, all reflected the same underlying design philosophy. The network must continue to function even when significant portions of it have been destroyed. The 13th structure takes us to the British side of the Cold War and to a facility that represents the British government's version of the continuity problems that drove American underground construction throughout the same period. The Burlington facility, built beneath the town of Corsham in Wiltshire, England, was the British government's designated war headquarters during the Cold War. Constructed in a former limestone quarry that had been converted to underground use during the Second World War, Burlington was expanded and equipped throughout the 1950s and early 1960s to serve as the headquarters from which the British government would exercise authority during and after a nuclear war. Burlington was designed to accommodate up to 4,000 people, including the Prime Minister, senior cabinet members, civil servants from key ministries, and military personnel. It had its own BBC studio from which official broadcasts could be made to whatever population survived. It had a hospital, a canteen, a telephone exchange, and enough supplies to sustain its occupants for 3 months. The water supply was connected to a nearby reservoir, and the facility had its own power generation capacity. The BBC studio was perhaps the most revealing single detail of Burlington's purpose. The government expected that, in the aftermath of a nuclear attack, broadcasting to the surviving population would be one of its primary functions, and that broadcasting needed to come from somewhere identifiable as the legitimate government rather than from an improvised facility. Burlington was decommissioned in 2004, and the British government subsequently disclosed its existence and opened parts of it to journalists and researchers. What those who visited it described was a facility frozen in time, its equipment still in place, its corridors still lined with the filing cabinets and office furniture of the Cold War era, its telephone exchange still bearing the old-fashioned handsets of the 1960s. Burlington had been maintained in operational readiness until its decommissioning, and then simply closed and left as it was. The limestone quarry that had been carved out to create it still exists beneath the Wiltshire countryside, and the facility itself remains largely intact. The 14th structure is one of the most technically sophisticated of all the Cold War systems, and one of the least known to the general public. The ground wave emergency network, known as GWEN, was a system of radio relay towers built across the continental United States in the 1980s to provide a communication network that would survive nuclear attack by operating at very low frequencies, which are not disrupted by the electromagnetic pulse effects of nuclear detonations in the way that higher frequency communication systems are. GWEN towers were positioned approximately 200 miles apart in a network designed to relay messages from one end of the country to the other, even if some towers in the network were destroyed, by routing traffic around the damaged nodes. GWEN was specifically designed to communicate with nuclear weapons delivery systems, particularly the bomber force and the land-based missile force, in the period following a nuclear attack. The assumption was that satellites might be destroyed or their signals degraded, that high-frequency radio would be disrupted by electromagnetic pulse and by ionospheric disturbances caused by nuclear detonations, and that a reliable terrestrial very low-frequency network would therefore be essential for maintaining communication with forces in the period when the outcome of an exchange was still being determined. GWEN was supposed to be the communication backbone of a nuclear war that had already started and was continuing. The system was never completed to its original design specifications, partly due to cost and partly due to opposition from communities where towers were planned. By the time it was operational, changes in the strategic environment and in satellite communication technology had begun to reduce its relevance. GWEN was eventually decommissioned in the mid-1990s, but its existence represents something important about the Cold War mindset of the 1980s, which was a period of significant escalation in the specificity and elaborateness of American nuclear war planning. The Reagan administration's approach to nuclear strategy involved not just deterrence, but what its strategists called war-fighting capability, meaning the ability to fight a nuclear war, sustain that fighting over an extended period, and prevail. GWEN was a piece of that architecture. It was built not for deterrence, but for the war that deterrence was supposed to prevent. The 15th structure is Soviet and represents a category of Cold War engineering that is rarely discussed in Western accounts of the period. The Soviet system of deep underground shelters in major cities was far more extensive than anything attempted in the United States, reflecting a fundamental difference in how the two countries approached the question of civilian survival. American civil defense planning during the Cold War was, for most of the period, relatively modest. The emphasis was on deterrence rather than survival, and the investment in civilian shelter infrastructure reflected that emphasis. The Soviet approach was different. Soviet civil defense doctrine placed a much higher premium on ensuring the survival of a substantial portion of the civilian population, and the investment in civilian shelter infrastructure was correspondingly much larger. In Moscow, The subway system served as the most visible component of this shelter infrastructure. The Moscow metro was built with stations unusually deep underground and with blast doors designed to seal the tunnels in the event of a nuclear attack. The system could accommodate millions of people in an emergency. But beyond the public metro, Soviet planners had built an extensive network of purpose-built shelters beneath Moscow and other major cities, designed to protect both the population and, more critically, the industrial and administrative infrastructure that would be needed to rebuild after an attack. Soviet civil defense doctrine was not merely about keeping people alive. It was about ensuring that the country retained the organizational and industrial capacity to continue functioning as a state after a nuclear exchange. And that required protecting not just military command, but the broader administrative and economic infrastructure. This difference in approach had strategic implications that American planners found concerning. If the Soviets could protect a significant portion of their population and industrial base, and if American civil defense was minimal, then the asymmetry in post-exchange recovery capacity favored the Soviets. A country that survives a nuclear war with more of its population and industrial base intact is, in some meaningful, if horrific sense, in a better strategic position than one that survives with less. American planners who took Soviet civil defense seriously argued that this asymmetry needed to be factored into American nuclear targeting strategy, and it was. The 16th structure is also Soviet, and it is perhaps the most audacious engineering project of the entire Cold War. The Kapustin Yar and Plesetsk launch facilities were the Soviet equivalents of American missile test ranges and launch sites, but they represented something beyond mere technical infrastructure. Plesetsk Cosmodrome in northern Russia was the most active launch site in the world for much of the Cold War, used for both military satellite launches and ballistic missile testing. Its scale and the tempo of operations conducted there reflected the extraordinary industrial investment the Soviet Union made in its space and missile programs. Thousands of personnel, hundreds of support facilities, extensive transportation infrastructure, and a security perimeter that extended for tens of kilometers surrounded what was, in operational terms, a factory for inserting military payloads into orbit and for testing the missiles that would deliver nuclear warheads. What made Plesetsk significant beyond its technical functions was what it represented about the Soviet approach to the Cold War more broadly. The Soviets built their strategic programs at a scale and with an industrial logic that reflected central planning at its most ambitious. The American programs were large, but they were managed differently through competitive contracting and a more distributed industrial base. The Soviet approach concentrated expertise and infrastructure in specific locations and facilities that were then developed to an extraordinary degree. Plesetsk was not just a launch site. It was a city organized around launch operations, with its own social infrastructure, its own hierarchy, its own culture. The people who worked there spent careers there. Their children grew up there. The facility had a permanence and a density of human investment that is difficult to convey from the outside. The 17th structure is an American facility that remained classified far longer than most of its contemporaries and whose existence tells a particular story about how the intelligence and operational communities of the Cold War related to each other. Pine Gap, located near Alice Springs in the Australian outback, is a joint facility operated by the United States and Australia that serves as a major ground control station for American intelligence satellites. Pine Gap was established in 1966 under a treaty that has been renewed multiple times and that gives the United States primary operational control of the facility while giving Australia the political cover of joint operation. Pine Gap is not just a ground station. It is one of the primary nodes in the American signals intelligence architecture, receiving and processing data from satellites monitoring communications, missile launches, and military movements across a vast portion of the globe. Its location in the Southern Hemisphere gives American intelligence coverage of areas that facilities in the Northern Hemisphere cannot cover as effectively, including the Indian Ocean region, parts of Asia, and the southern polar approaches. The facility was expanded significantly during the Cold War as the satellite systems it supported became more capable, and it has continued to expand in the decades since. Pine Gap has been the subject of considerable political controversy in Australia, where its presence has generated periodic public debate about the nature of the Australian-American alliance and about what exactly the facility does. Those debates have been conducted mostly without the benefit of detailed information about the facility's actual capabilities, because those capabilities remain classified. What is publicly known is the general nature of the mission, signals intelligence collection, and the fact of American operational control. The specifics of what the satellites see, what the analysis produces, and how that information flows into American military and intelligence operations are not public. The 18th structure is the most recent of the Cold War facilities examined here, in the sense that it was built in the latest period of the Cold War and most directly reflects the specific strategic anxieties of the 1980s. The extremely low frequency, or ELF, communication system, which included 2 installations, one in Wisconsin called Project Sanguine, later redesignated Project ELF, and one in Michigan called Project Seafarer, though that project was ultimately not built to its original specifications, was designed to solve a specific and critical problem in nuclear command and control. Submarines carrying ballistic missiles represented the most survivable leg of the American nuclear triad, meaning the combination of land-based missiles, bombers, and submarine-based missiles that formed the backbone of American nuclear deterrence. They were survivable precisely because they were submerged, and a submerged submarine is extremely difficult to locate and destroy. But communicating with a submerged submarine is also extremely difficult. Radio waves at normal frequencies do not penetrate seawater to any useful depth. To communicate with a submarine at operational depth required either having the submarine come close to the surface, which compromised its concealment, or using extremely low-frequency radio signals, which penetrate seawater to depths of several hundred feet. The ELF system addressed the communication problem. By transmitting at frequencies of around 76 Hz, the system could send signals to submarines at operational depth anywhere in the world. The limitations were severe. The transmission rate was extremely slow, measured in characters per minute rather than words per second, and the antennas required for ELF transmission were enormous, covering hundreds of square miles of terrain. The Wisconsin installation had 2 transmitter stations connected by a cable antenna buried in the ground, spread across a vast area of the Chequamegon National Forest. The signals the system transmitted were not messages in any conventional sense. They were alert signals, pre-coded sequences that told submarine crews to come to a depth where they could receive more detailed instructions through higher frequency communication channels. The ELF system was controversial from its inception, both because of the land requirements for the antenna arrays and because of concerns about the biological effects of extremely low-frequency electromagnetic fields on the people and animals living near the installations. The environmental opposition to the system was substantial and generated years of political conflict. The system was eventually built in a scaled-down form and operated from the 1980s until 2004, when it was decommissioned. For 2 decades, the buried copper cables running through the national forest carried signals that could reach American submarines anywhere in the world, telling them to prepare to receive orders that might include the command to launch nuclear missiles. The 19th and final structure in this account is not a building at all in the physical sense, but it is perhaps the most complete expression of the Cold War's organizing principle. The Single Integrated Operational Plan, known as SIOP, was the American Nuclear War Plan, the document that specified what would happen in operational detail if the United States launched a nuclear strike or responded to a Soviet nuclear attack. The SIOP was not public. It was among the most highly classified documents in the American government. But it was also, in a meaningful sense, a structure, because it was the organizing architecture into which all of the physical structures described in this narration were embedded. The missile silos, the command posts, The communication networks, the airborne command centers, the submarine fleets, all of these things had meaning and operational purpose only in relation to the PSYOP. The PSYOP was the plan that gave the structures their function. What made the PSYOP remarkable, and what made it terrifying to the small number of people who were briefed on its specifics, was its scale. The first version of the PSYOP, developed in 1960, called for the simultaneous delivery of essentially the entire American nuclear arsenal against targets in the Soviet Union, China, and Eastern European countries allied with the Soviet Union. The number of warheads involved was in the thousands. The number of targets was also in the thousands. The number of projected casualties was in the hundreds of millions. Military planners who were briefed on the PSYOP in the early 1960s found it disturbing enough that some of them lobbied, unsuccessfully for years, for a more selective approach that would allow for options short of complete simultaneous use of the entire arsenal. Those lobbying efforts eventually succeeded in producing a modified version of the PSYOP that included more limited options, allowing the president to authorize strikes on specific categories of targets without automatically triggering the use of the entire arsenal. But the logic of the PSYOP was always the logic of the structures described in this narration, which was the logic of an automated, pre-planned, pre-authorized response that minimized the time and cognitive burden placed on human decision-makers in the moments when decisions needed to be made. The PSYOP was designed for a world in which there would be very little time to think, which meant that the thinking had to be done in advance, the decisions pre-made, the structures pre-built, and the systems pre-positioned to execute whatever the plan called for with the maximum possible speed and minimum possible hesitation. This is what the Cold War built. Not the bombs themselves, though it built those too, in numbers that still defy easy comprehension. What the Cold War built, at a deeper level, was a set of systems and structures designed to function in the absence of the civilization that built them. The bunkers were designed to survive the destruction of the cities around them. The communication networks were designed to function after the destruction of the normal infrastructure they connected. The command procedures were designed to operate after the destruction of the personnel who would normally exercise command. The nuclear plans were pre-made so that decisions would not have to be made in the moment when making decisions would be most difficult and most consequential. The Cold War ended in 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The bunkers did not close. The communication systems did not go offline. The nuclear forces did not stand down to zero. The PSYOP was revised but not discontinued. The submarines continued their patrols. The missiles remained in their silos. The airborne command aircraft continued rotating through their alert cycles. The perimeter system, or its successor, continued whatever function it performs inside the Russian military command structure. The structures built for a world without people outlasted the geopolitical framework that justified their construction, and they remain, in modified form, as operational today as they were at the height of the confrontation. They were built to survive. The Cold War ended. The systems it created did not.